Hey guys, it's Bang for Buck PC Gamer here. About a month ago I did make the leap to 4K, and that was coming straight from 1080p gaming. Now that was a massive leap for myself in visual quality, and for the most part my single Nvidia GTX 980Ti, which was overclocked, provided decent performance. Some games run well over 60 frames per second, and with high image quality settings minus anti-aliasing, and a few others like The Witcher 3, Crisis 3 and some other demanding games, regardless of the removal of anti-aliasing at high quality settings, did come up short when it came to performance. So adding a second GTX 980 Ti was always on my agenda, and I finally got around to doing so. So what I'm going to do today is share with you my performance increase from going from one card to two, and how it actually runs on a Z97 platform with an overclocked Intel i7-4790K. So I'll start off with showing you the cards I'm going to be using for this test, and the reason why I've chosen them, and I'll also tell you about the method I'm going to use, and hopefully you guys will enjoy the rest of the video. So this is the card I ended up purchasing. I ended up going with the Zotac GeForce GTX 980 reference design. I bought my first card on about 2 days after launch, and that version was a Inno 3D version. It was also a reference design. I ended up having to pay £575 at the time, and prices have come down a little bit since then, so that's good to see. I was able to get this one from Zotac for £500. Overclockers in the UK did have a bit of a sale, which they do usually have weekly, so it's definitely one of my #1 stores to go for in the UK. So I was able to get this for £500. The reason I went with the reference design is because I didn't want any heat building up in my PC case, and with these reference designs they have the blow fan design, which takes all the hot air and ports it straight out the back, so there's no hot air getting circulated in your case, which you'll get with say something like a Gigabyte G1 gaming version, or a MSI G6 or something like that with the triple fan design. So when it comes to multiple GPUs, the blow fan reference design is not exactly a bad choice to go with. So that's my thinking when it comes to that. So now you're wondering, what do you get from spending over £1,000 on graphics cards? Well, I'm about to show you a few games, and I'll go through the settings I'm going to use. I'm going to be using 1440p with one card, then I'll be doing 1440p results with two cards, and I'll do the same again with 4K. I've opted not to do 1080p results, as someone who's going to spend this much money on a pair of graphics cards is definitely not interested in gaming at 1080p. That's my thinking behind that. It's not because I don't think no one games at 1080p anymore. I just think you spend that kind of money on two GTX 980 Ti's, you've definitely got a high refresh rate monitor at 1440p or a 4K display in mind to go with it. So I hope you guys can understand that. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through my system specs and settings before I start the game testing. I'm using obviously two GTX 980 Ti's using drivers 355.98, which are the latest drivers as of today's date. I'm also running both cards at stock. I haven't had much time to play around with my new card yet, so I'm not too sure what it's capable of. So I'm running both cards at stock for the time being, and that will give you a good indication of what two GTX 980 Ti's will do at the bare minimum. For the processor, I'm using the Intel i7-4790K, which I've overclocked to 4.8 GHz. I'm using an Asus Maximus 7 Ranger motherboard, which is a Z97 chipset. This does mean that both of my cards will be running at 8 times on the PCI Express lane, but that's okay because not many cards do saturate PCI Express 3.0 lanes at the moment anyway, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I'm using 16 gigabytes of Corsair Pro Series Vengeance that runs at 2400 megahertz, and I'm using an Corsair AX 860 power supply to power the whole system. So that's all the important specs out of the way, and I want to move on to the games now. So I'm going to start off with Crysis 3. I'll go through the in-game settings that I chose for this game. Obviously the resolution was altered between 2160p, which is 4K, and 1440p. I used SMAA at medium, which is 2x. Texture resolution was at very high, and system specs were at very high. Going into the system specs, I used 16 times anisotropic filtering. I disabled motion blur because I think every PC gamer disables motion blur because it's terrible and pretty much benefits console gamers that game predominantly at 30 frames per second. And obviously lens flares is enabled, so that's pretty much it for the settings.
Lots changed. This is how it all started. People signed up with Cell for cheap energy. Cell were generating power for free, and nobody could compete with free. Before long, they had a monopoly. Bills went up. People had nothing left except their debt. Cell marched them out and into the volunteer camps. Nothing but slavery. Hold up. Minefield. Cell's using intelligent munitions. Well, that's one way to do it. That should be enough. Come on.
So when it comes to Crysis 3, a single GTX 980Ti only manages 56 frames per second on the minimum and 65 on the average. When you combine the two and go SLI, it jumps up to 71 frames per second on the minimum and 90 frames per second on the average. So about a 25 frames per second increase on the average frames, which is not the best when it comes to scaling, but it's definitely a solid frame rate for such a high resolution. I'm looking at 4K. A single card managing 27 frames per second on the minimum and 32 on the average. Jumping up to SLI, you can get a 38 minimum and a 45 frames per second on the average. So Crysis 3 showing about a 13 frames per second increase when it comes to going to SLI on the average frames per second. So this goes to show you, such a demanding game, you'll definitely need to get into overclocking and possibly minimizing anti-aliasing settings to reach as close to 60 frames per second as possible. So moving on to The Witcher 3, I'll go through the in-game settings that I chose. I am using, obviously, between a resolution of 2160p and 1440p. Nvidia Hairworks was enabled. Anti-aliasing was set to 2 times. The hairset preset for Hairworks is at high. Everything else was pretty much maxed out at ultra settings. And when it comes to post-processing, HBAO plus for ambient occlusion. I keep sharpening that low, as I think high makes it look a bit too cartoonish. It doesn't actually impact the performance in any way, it's just a personal preference for myself. Depth of field, chromatic aberration, vignetting, light shafts were all enabled, and anti-aliasing was also enabled. Okay, looking at the Witcher 3 results, you can see that one GTX 980Ti at 1440p will give you a decent frame rate of 52 frames per second on the minimum and 59 on the average. When you add a second card and move on to SLI, you can expect an increase of 43 frames per second and giving you 102 frames per second on average and 91 frames per second on the minimum. At 4K is kind of a different story. The scaling is very, very poor. And when a single GTX 980Ti is barely playable, you'll get 30 on the minimums and about 32 on average. Adding the second card, it will give you a 10 frames per second increase on average and giving you a 42 frames per second average at 4K, but not a very good increase. This is definitely one of those games you're going to have to definitely resort to overclocking and maybe even reducing anti-aliasing settings to boost those frames per second and getting as close to 60 as possible. So just to quickly go through the settings of Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, I'm using obviously the same resolutions as before, between 1440p and 2160, and pretty much everything maxed out. And before you ask, yes, I did uncap the frames per second, so there is no frames per second cap in this video, so we should see exactly what two GTX 980 Ti's can do at 4K. So the Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain seems to do very well with a single GTX 980 Ti at 1440p. So not much improvement when moving on to SLI on the average frames, with only an increase of 13 frames per second. 4K definitely showed a better increase in performance. A single GTX 980 Ti gives you 51 on average, and then bumping up to 80 frames per second when going SLI. So that's a 29 frames per second increase, which is definitely a good sign, and it will give you smooth frames per second throughout the whole game. So looking pretty good on Metal Gear Solid for scaling at the higher resolutions. Okay, so moving on to Tomb Raider, which is pretty much the holy grail when it comes to GPU scaling. This game engine utilizes multiple GPUs pretty much as best as any other game I've ever seen, so expect very good scaling results with this game. So the in-game settings that I used were obviously between 2160 and 1440p, and I used ultra texture quality. I did use FXAA, which is anti-aliasing. All other settings were at their maximum. So shadow resolution, high is the highest, and everything else can go to ultra. It's the same with reflections, high is the highest in-game setting possible. Post-processing, high precision and tessellation were also enabled. So looking at Tomb Raider, a single GTX 980 at 1440p will do 86 frames per second on average, and while jumping up to SLI, that will increase to 161 frames per second, so an increase of 75 frames per second, which just goes to show you how well this game scales. Looking at 4K, one card will give you 33 frames per second minimum and 43 on average. Using SLI, you'll go up to 76 frames per second on average at 4K and 58 frames per second on the minimum with two cards. So that's an increase of 33 frames per second, which is almost double performance, which is definitely nice to see at 4K, as it is very demanding. So that about wraps it up for the games I've tested with the two GTX 980 Ti's in SLI at stock settings. So far I'm pretty impressed with what the cards can offer in performance at the higher resolutions. If you're someone with a 1440p monitor with a high refresh rate, then this is definitely a multi-GPU setup that you may want to consider, as it does deliver fantastic performance at 1440p. At 4K you will definitely need to do a bit of overclocking if you want to reach or get even closer to that 60 frames per second frame rate at 4K, as it's such a demanding resolution. I can't wait personally to tweak my two cards and find out what my maximum stable core clock is for both cards, but I'm definitely pleased with the performance on a whole at stock settings. Anyway, that's enough from me, guys. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching.